Hello, and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we're talking about one of the most ubiquitous aspects of human history, the use of flour. We're not talking about only wheat flour. No, nearly every culture ever documented has a tradition of grinding an edible plant or nut into a dry powder we can term flour.
In our modern world, we feel fortunate to have options beyond wheat and cornmeal to almond, oat, rye, millet, amaranth, cassava flours available at our fingertips. Funnily enough, none of these are modern developments. The Merriam-Webster definition of flour is a product consisted of finely milled wheat, also a similar product made from another grain or food product such as dried potatoes or fish. Fish flour. Today we're going to take you on a whirlwind tour of the flours or meals used by the peoples we talk about at the museum.
To start us off is Mark talking about West African flours and the products they make.
So today I'm going to talk to you all about yams, one of the primary starches coming out of West Africa and serving as a cash crop for the Igbo, who are the specific group that we're talking about here at the Frontier Culture Museum. West Africa has several different climates, and each one produces a different starch. North of the Igbo in the Sahel, where the Malian Empire was located, they're growing grains like millet, while the river deltas and floodplains are cultivating rice. But the Igbo, who are mostly living in modern-day Nigeria, lived in the rainforest, and their principal cultivated crop is going to be yams. Now, yams are farmed typically in mounds with either a pole for the vine to grow up or a trellis, and if planted near a large tree, the vines will grow up the tree. Now, what they're trying to grow is the root tubular that is formed and harvested, and that's what's used for food. It's going to be used similarly to other root tubulars like potatoes or sweet potatoes. But the tubulars for the yams are covered with a soft flesh, typically brown looking, kind of like tree bark or the shell of a peanut, but it's soft and smooth to the touch. The flesh of the yam is firm and normally white or yellowish in color. The typical yam weighs about 5 to 10 pounds on the small side, but they can grow much larger and can be up to 50 or 60 pounds. Now that we've talked a little bit about yams, let's talk about cooking it. They're commonly cooked by grilling them, frying them, or boiling the yams. Boiled yams that are then mashed are called fufu by the Igbo. With the size of the yams, you're going to need a bigger than normal mortise and pestle. They're going to be larger in that part of the world because of the type of plants they're growing. The mortars are going to be about the size of, generally made out of wood, that would hold a basketball in it. And the pestle is going to be about the size of an adult's arm, tapered on one end to be the handle and rounded on the other to help pound the yam into fufu. Now, the fufu, after it's been boiled and pounded, has a consistency between mashed potatoes and Play-Doh. And this is used to its advantage when you're eating fufu. The way you're going to do is you're going to reach and take out a small bowl in your hand of fufu and shape it with your thumb. At that point, you're going to then take it and dip it into any sauces or stews that have been prepared and bring the whole thing to you. While the fufu itself is rather bland, the flavor is coming from those sauces. Some of the more common ones used are going to be peanut soup, palm nut soup, and pepper paste. For West Africa, fufu and yams are a significant part of both the diet in the 18th century as well as still today in Nigeria. For the Igbo, it's an essential part of their staple crops and their domestic production for foodstuffs. And it's going to take on a cultural significance for the Igbo. Today, there are still yam harvest festivals celebrated all over Nigeria.
Thanks, Mark. I can attest to the deliciousness of fufu used to scoop up okra stew. Next is Sally talking about alternatives to wheat in 17th century England.
Bread in 17th century England can be categorized into several kinds using different flours. Specifically, I'm referring to manchet bread for the wealthy and pease bread, horse bread, or brown bread, which is agreeable for laborers. Manchet bread is a small, tender loaf made of the finest, whitest flour of the day, using yeast or barm from brewing for leavening, not sourdough. The shape was round or oval. The size varied with the price of wheat. William Harrison, in the book Description of England, 1577, said it was 8 ounces into the oven and 6 ounces coming out. Pease bread or horse bread was used for the poorer folks in England or during hard times. Horse bread was a type of bread sometimes consumed in medieval Europe. This bread was, at the time, considered a low-quality bread made from legumes, such as dry split peas and bran, as well as, or instead of, grains such as oats and seeds like ground acorns. It was one of the cheapest breads available. As the name suggests, it was allegedly fit only for the horses to eat, but for many of the poorer people as well in times of famine. As Gervase Markham has mentioned, flours can be mixed like wheat and barley, wheat and rye, or rye and barley. For peas bread, dried peas and or beans were ground up and added to wheat and rye flour. The peas had been left to mature and dry in the pods, becoming starchy and packed with proteins. These dense or coarse breads sustained the laborers or servants who were working outside, working hard in the fields, or shearing sheep, or performing tasks requiring a high caloric intake. Brown bread is another name used for a mixture of flours that may be on the mill floor as well as including dried peas and beans. At the Frontier Culture Museum, we make historic flour which approximates what would have been used in the 17th and 18th centuries. Historic flour includes white flour, wheat germ, wheat bran, and pastry flour. Today, some of these coarse, dense flours are making a comeback. Peas meal, for example, is gluten-free, high in carbohydrates and protein. These denser, coarser flours are actually healthier for us all. Interesting that historically, the laborers or working class were actually eating healthier bread than their wealthier countrymen. And I'm going to now read 2 receipts. A receipt for making manchet bread, which comes from the English Housewife by Gervase Markham in 1615, and another receipt for brown bread. And I'll begin again first with manchet. Now for the baking of bread of your simple meals, your best and principal bread is manchet, which you shall bake in this manner. First, your meal being ground upon the black stones, if it be possible, which makes the whitest flour, and bolted through the finest bolting cloth, you shall put it into a clean kimnel, which is a kneading tub, and opening the flour hollow in the midst, put into it of the best ale barm the quantity of 3 pints to a bushel of meal, with some salt to season it with, then put in your liquor, reasonable warm, and knead it very well together, both with your hands and through the break, which is a kneading device, or want thereof, fold it in a cloth, and with your feet tread it in a good space together. Then letting it lie an hour or thereabouts to swell, take it forth and mold it into manchets, round and flat and slashed about the waist, to give it to leave to rise, and prick it with your knife in the top, and so put it into the oven and bake it with a gentle heat. Modern translation: a stiff dough usually requires a pound of flour to each 8 ounces of liquid. For a manageable batch, take 3 cups of unbleached flour, of which 3 tablespoons should be wheat germ, and 3 tablespoons sifted whole wheat flour, 1 cup water at blood temperature, 1/2 ounce of compressed yeast or 3/4 tablespoon of dry yeast, and a good teaspoon of sea salt. This will make 3 beautiful manchets that should be baked at 350 degrees. And now for the other receipt, which is the baking of brown bread from the English Housewife, also written by Gervase Markham in 1615. For your brown bread, or bread for your hind servants, which is the coarsest bread for man's use, you shall take of barley 2 bushels, of peas 2 pecks, of wheat or rye a peck of malt. These you shall grind together and dress it through a meal sieve. Then, putting it into a sour trough, set liquor on the fire, and when it boils, let 1 put on the water, and another with a mash rudder, stir some of the flour with it, and after it hath been seasoned with salt, and so let it be until the next day. And then, putting to the rest of the flour, work it up into a stiff leaven. Then mold it and bake it into great loaves, with a very strong heat. Now if your trough be not sour enough to sour your leaven, then you shall either let it lie longer in the trough, or else take the help of a sour leaven with your boiling water. For you must understand that the hotter your liquor is, the less will the swell or the rankness of the peas be received. And thus much for the baking of any kind of bread with our English housewife shall have occasion to use for the maintenance of her family. And please do remember to knock on it to make sure it has a hollow sound all around the base, and then you know that your bread will be uniformly done all the way through.
Thank you, Sally. I think I'm going to avoid peas bread for as long as possible. Another population that had strong knowledge of poverty and hunger was Ireland.
Now we are going to talk about oats. And when you think of oats, generally you tend to think about Scotland and Ireland and porridge, which is a good thing because porridge is absolutely delicious if you season it with something like maple syrup, which they were not doing in Scotland and Ireland. But oats is a very old grain, like all the other grains, and there is evidence in Italy that traces of wild oats were found on a tool resembling a pestle in a cave occupied by Paleolithic hunters around 32,000 years ago. The Paleolithic people ground up the wild oats to form flour, which they may have boiled or baked into simple flatbread, says the researchers. This seems something very similar to oat cakes, which the Irish are eating on a daily basis. These people also seem to have heated the grains before grinding them, perhaps to dry them out in the cooler climate of the time. This also would have made the grain easier to grind and long-lasting. The research hopes to continue studying ancient grinding stones to find out more about the Paleolithic plant diet. Grinding stones go back a long way, and people may well have been pounding and eating various wild grains even earlier than 32,000 years ago. The origins of the cultivation of oats is not clearly known, but oats certainly were cultivated in the past in several different regions. For instance, cultivated oats remains were found in caves in Switzerland that date back to around 1000 BCE. Not until about the beginning of the Christian era references to oats as a cultivated crop are found in literature. Oats have suffered a bad press for centuries. The Roman author Pliny, writing of the Germanic tribes who were dedicated oat eaters, asked disdainfully, how can one eat the same food as animals? However, he did admit that in Central Europe, where oats were served both for porridge and bread, the diet seemed to endow its eaters with good health. Of course, we now know about the healthy benefits of soluble fiber in oats. Oats made their way into Europe far after wheat and barley were already established crops. In fact, it is widely believed oats traveled through Europe as a contaminant of the wheat and barley seed trade. Because of this, in many places, oats were viewed as weeds competing with the wheat or barley crop. Part of their eventual success in Europe is due to the fact that oats were well adapted to cool and wet environments. Think of Scotland and Ireland. And so by the first century, oats had become a prominent European crop. Samuel Johnson, an Englishman, in his 1755 publication, A Dictionary of the English Language, disdainfully defined the word oats thusly, a grain which in England is generally given to horses, but in Scotland supports the people. To this, his Scottish friend and biographer James Boswell is said to have replied, aye, and that's why England has such fine horses and Scotland such fine people. Oatmeal is an important ingredient in haggis, Scotland's national dish. It is a mixture of minced offal, suet, and oatmeal seasoning with herbs and other spices. Haggis was also eaten by ancient Greeks and Romans. We did a podcast on haggis in January, so if you're interested to learn more about haggis, I suggest going back and listening to this podcast. A forerunner to our modern toddies is this ancient 15th century Scottish drink made from oatmeal, honey, and whiskey. Add an egg for medicinal purposes. It sounded good until you had to add an egg. I think I might pass on this. In 1727, a farmer who lived within a mile of Edinburgh planted 8 acres of wheat instead of oats, and it was considered such an extraordinary phenomenon that the populace of Edinburgh trooped out to see it. The Scottish folk even used oats as a substitute for soap, and there was certain custom of breaking an oatcake over a bride's head to convey the wish that she and her family should never lack food during her married life. Oats made their way to America with early European settlers. The Dutch grew oats in New Netherlands area of colonial America by 1626, and oats were cultivated in Virginia prior to 1648. Oats were generally grown throughout the colonial American period, mainly for animal feed, but Scottish, Dutch, and Irish immigrants used them in their traditional porridges, puddings, and baked goods. Speaking of traditional porridges, on our Irish farm, and really all over Ireland in the 17th and 18th century, oats was a considerable part of their diet. The main way they ate it was to make something called pottage, which is sort of like oatmeal. They would heat it up over the fire and they would add other elements to it. Sometimes it could be things like turnips, sometimes it could be spinach, sometimes it could be fish or even meat. And one of the things that historians believe, and it's hard to think that people believe this, but it seems to be true, is that they would not clean out the pottage after every day because that would take away some of the taste, and they would just add things to it every single day. Which, if you think about it, that makes the nursery rhyme peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, I like my peas porridge 9 days old, make much more sense. Pottage not only was eaten in Ireland, it was also eaten in Scotland and England, and it was a very easy dish to make, which makes sense because of the amount of work that had to be done on these farms where everyone was tending to the gardens, tending to the crops, spinning, weaving, and doing all the other works. Pottage is a very easy dish to make. Another dish the Irish ate a lot of was oatcakes, and oatcakes is just made from grinding up the oats into flour, mixing it with salt and water, and frying it on a griddle over the fire in the hearth. This has an interesting taste, or I should say, it really has no taste until you put butter on it, and then it tastes wonderful. I think I am being very mean because when I was in Ireland, I did have oatcakes, and they were delicious, and they were nothing like the oatcakes I seem to have had in this country or in Virginia. To many Americans in the 1850s, oats was still considered livestock food, not fit for human consumption. But a German named Ferdinand Schumacher, who was a grocer, set out to change that when he opened the German Mills American Oatmeal Factory in Akron, Ohio in 1856. Shoemaker found success due to both the cheap nature of oat milling as well as strong support from Irish and German immigrants who were already accustomed to eating oats. He became known as the Oatmeal King. He was one of the founders of the companies which merged to become the Quaker Oats Company. Something that today we are still buying Quaker Oats. Rounding out the old world is Karen with Germany.
Here in the United States, most people eat bread in one form or another at each meal. These foods are generally made from bread wheat, also called common wheat. Today there are 14 species of wheat and about 30,000 varieties. Some of the more unusual wheats are ancient ones, such as einkorn and emmer, which is mentioned in the Bible. Spelt is an ancient wheat which was a staple in Europe until the Middle Ages, but is now grown mostly in Central Europe. The problem with these ancient types of wheat has to do with the structure of the grain itself. Each grain of wheat is enclosed by a hull or husk, which must be removed before it can be consumed. But in these ancient types, the husk is tough and tightly attached to the grain. Threshing separates the grain from the stalk, but removing the husk of these ancient grains requires milling or pounding. This tough husk helps protect the grain from spoilage and pests. Other wheats, like bread wheat, have been modified so the grain and husk are easily separated during threshing. The easier processing of these modern wheats led to their dominance. Today, some ancient wheats have found new markets as health foods, particularly spelt. It has a high carbohydrate content, and its gluten is suitable for baking, plus, it's more soluble. This makes it easier to digest by people allergic to wheat products, although it's not suitable for those with celiac disease. Germans have recognized the health aspects of spelt since the Middle Ages, particularly its digestibility. Another type of cereal grain is rye. Rye has long been considered inferior to wheat in both quality and digestibility, but it has much larger kernels and is more hardy, which were attractive qualities for the working classes of Europe, Britain, and America. One very appealing quality of rye was, and is, the whiskey made from it. Historically, English folk in the colonies, as well as back home in England, typically made everyday bread of mixed flours, rye and wheat, or rye, barley, and wheat. Among the English in Pennsylvania, rye bread usually consisted of one-third rye, one-third wheat, and one-third barley. Pennsylvania Germans often followed that pattern, using spelt instead of bread wheat. But not all of them grew spelt, and in areas where farming was closer to subsistence level, rye, with its tolerance of poor growing conditions, was the main crop. In cooking, rye was often mixed with cornmeal. According to food historian William Woys Weaver, spelt was known as German wheat in colonial America because of its association with the Pennsylvania Germans. They raised wheat as a cash crop and shipped it to Philadelphia or Baltimore and raised spelt for their own use, as food for themselves as well as for their horses. Spelt is rich in nutrients and produces a better yield per acre than oats and has superior straw. Those lucky horses. Among Germans in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, spelt was considered the only acceptable flour for gingerbread. The high gluten content also contributes to the fine pretzels associated with German cookery. Today, these once hard-to-find grains are readily available as flours in most grocery stores. If the pandemic of 2020 turned you into a bread baker, consider trying some of these historic varieties.
Misty is going to tell us about the wide variety used by the Eastern Woodlands Indians.
The evolution of agriculture in the Eastern Woodlands is as varied geographically and temporally as is any other region in the world, but the scholarship on this topic is relatively new, dating to about the 1940s. It was during this period that anthropologists and ethnobotanists began to examine seeds found in the assemblages of cave shelters and bluff dwellings in the area of Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Their discovery of early cultivars led to the designation of those areas as the Eastern Agricultural Complex, one of only 10 prehistoric independent centers of plant domestication in the world. It's worth noting that this evidence also correlated with the evidence of various groups of people within this region becoming more sedentary. This new research allowed archaeological specialists like archaeobotanists to construct what some refer to as the chronology of agricultural husbandry within the Eastern Woodlands. Through the tracking of archenes, which is a type of simple dry fruit, a strawberry is actually an archene, and the morphology or shape change of other seeds and plant parts, the earliest forays into cultivation became evident within that region. The why of this is way more complex than can be tackled in a quick description, but the easiest way to conceptualize this is that hunter-gatherer communities, like in so many other places, started to take advantage of the use of wild plants for starchy or oily qualities and or their starchy greens. The earliest Eastern agricultural complex cultigen, Cucurbita, appeared around 7,000 years ago. Cucurbita pepo is a gourd variety that was likely first used for their seeds. In fact, my personal experience of trying a variety that we've grown at the museum, known as an egg gourd, is that the flesh of that is the most bitter, gross thing ever. But the seeds are tasty, and the rind can be used for some storage. The thick, fleshy squashes appeared much later. This plant was followed by sunflowers and sumpweed for oily seeds, areca-knotweed and goosefoot, a chenopod, for their leafy greens, and maygrass and little barley, likely grown for their flour. In the more western regions of the Eastern Agricultural Complex, amaranth was also grown for flour. The cultivation of any wild plant into a domesticate is a very long process, on the order, in some cases, of hundreds of years. The transformation of a society from hunter-gatherer to agriculturalist is by no means a linear process. There are a number of costs that would need to be factored in: cost of culture, cost of life, cost of organization, along with external factors like climate. This process often caused human populations to ebb and flow on the actual road to agricultural husbandry. But what is interesting in the study of these plant varieties and their changes over time is that ultimately the Eastern Agricultural Complex was most likely a huge factor in the spread of maize and beans about 1,000 years later. There truly were multiple pathways to the introduction of agriculture in the eastern woodlands, and as can be expected, there was a lot of geographic variety. So, where are these plants now? Many of them have reverted back into the wild and would most likely be sprayed with weed killer by modern people who are largely unaware of their various uses. But thanks to indigenous traditional knowledge specialists, along with botanical foragers, plants like the amaranth that we grow here at the museum are being reintroduced to the public.
Now, Rachel, you have done some research into the use of wheat flour in America.
Yep, one of my favorite farms to work on, especially bake on, is the 1820s farm from Timberville, Virginia. Not only does it have a recreation outdoor bake oven, which makes baking traditional things like rolls, breads, and pound cakes a breeze, but the farm itself was partially devoted to the growing of wheat. Colonial farmers had a difficult time with wheat. The climate lent itself to producing mildew rust on the growing wheat, thereby making an entire crop relatively useless for consumption. Rye and Indian meal, aka cornmeal, mixed with a bit of wheat flour was the norm for colonial baking. This made for heavier, denser baked goods than what modern palates are used to, leading to many receipt books of the time to have multiple receipts for things like gingerbread to provide a little variation. Better roads developed in the pre- and post-revolution period, which allowed for crops to be brought to mills before mildew and rot set in, vastly increasing the production of American wheat flour. White flour, as we know it, is wheat stripped of its bran and germ during the milling process, something that was refined with the advent of automated mills after the Revolution. Of course, commercial mills continued selling at a high price, so whole wheat, either home milled or locally milled with traditional methods, was still the flour of choice among farming families. Most of the commercial production of white flour was exported to Europe, given that it was much more shelf-stable and desperately needed by a continent continually at war. There was the Anglo-French War, the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, the Anglo-Spanish War. Are you sensing a trend? Not to mention numerous revolts, rebellions, uprisings, and the French Revolution. The domestic switch to purchasing commercial white wheat flour was after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, around 1815. Given its longer shelf life, white flour was able to be transported and sold in general stores in large quantities, sometimes far from its originating field. The increasing canal infrastructure and short rail lines by the 1830s, primarily devoted to moving agricultural produce to mills, slaughterhouses, and then on to larger centers of populations, helped the Shenandoah Valley farmers prosper. Devotion to wheat, the fertile soil, and the ability to move it beyond the valley to mills via rail helped form the breadbasket of the Confederacy during the American Civil War. Speaking culinarily, white flour was responsible for the rise of the array of baked goods we know today. The Great British Bake Off directly owes advances in milling technology for its weirdly entrancing production. White flour, being finer and without germ and bran, works better with yeast and other earlier leavening agents like pearl ash, thereby producing tasty things like fluffy French rolls and sponge cakes.
Well, I wish we could have some of that now. To round off our culinary tour of the museum, we'll turn it over to Michaela for a discussion of the 1850s.
One of the most vital food sources throughout world history is corn, also known as maize. Corn was originally domesticated by the indigenous peoples of Mexico and eventually grown throughout the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, or the United States. The Powhatan introduced maize to the colonists, which ended up saving the colonists from starvation. Many Virginia natives made a variety of dishes that featured meals including sapone, succotash, breads, porridges, ash cakes, hominy, and grits. They also roasted the ears green as a treat. By the 1850s, corn and pork were the main food staples. While wheat was king in the Virginia Shenandoah Valley, corn was grown for local and livestock consumption. Chief crops produced by Rockbridge County in 1850 by earnings were corn with 372,705 bushels, wheat with 193,338 bushels, oats with 172,769 bushels, and tobacco with 78,298 bushels. Technology in the 1850s also affected production, growth, and selling of corn. Historian Charles W. Turner refers to this time period as the Green Revolution, in which scientific methods were being applied to crops, livestock, soil, and education. Canals and railroads made shipping of corn cheaper and easier for farmers who previously had to rely on bringing crops to town by wagon load. New prototypes were being experimented on, including huskers and corn planters. By 1850, a hand-powered single corn cob sheller was readily available to some rural farmers. At the Frontier Culture Museum, we feature an 1850s house originally from Botetourt County. John Barger, the original owner of the house, has been recorded to have fields of corn, wheat, oats, tobacco, and buckwheat. Mr. Barger, like many farmers, probably used the corn to feed his family and his large plethora of livestock, but also Mr. Barger owned a distillery where he was running off corn whiskey. While taxation issues on alcohol were not existent in 1850s Virginia, Mr. Barger did not sell much of his whiskey commercially. His still operation was on a much smaller scale than most commercial distilleries of the time period. Mr. Barger most likely made whiskey for personal use and shared with neighbors. Corn was eaten by whites and blacks alike, as it was easy and cheap to grow. Most cookbooks of the 1800s feature corn in one shape or another, and many receipts go back directly to the native ways of eating maize. The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph, published in 1824, showcases receipts like baked Indian meal pudding, cornmeal bread, and Johnny cakes with hominy. At the Frontier Culture Museum, we famously make corn cakes at our 1850s house. Corn cakes could have been seen at breakfast alongside bacon or at an evening meal served with stew. While there are many versions of corn cakes across 19th century cookbooks, the museum has a go-to version you can try at home. You will need milk, an egg, a fourth cup of flour, a half cup of cornmeal, some salt, a pinch of baking soda, and a tablespoon of melted butter. Mix these ingredients together in a large bowl. Heat your skillet up to medium heat. Put some butter on your pan. Corn cakes are just like pancakes, so pour the batter on the skillet like you would a pancake. Wait till you see bubbles in the mixture before flipping the cake. Serve the cakes hot, and if you like, with butter, syrup, or a pinch of salt on top.
Thanks, Michaela. Maybe some of you will like to try making those corn cakes at home. It's truly interesting how cultures blended and produced what we think of as typically American fare. Despite the often horrific circumstances and forced blending, we can now trace those elements back to the people they came from and can help reclaim certain stereotypes.
So we hope you enjoy Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We'll bring you historical episodes twice a month. You can check out the Frontier Culture Museum online at frontiermuseum.org, on Facebook and Instagram. You'll find background information on all the farms at the museum, information on upcoming events, and so much more.
If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please consider visiting the website and clicking the donate button. Donations to the American Frontier Culture Foundation support programs like field trips, summer camp, and special events. We'd greatly appreciate it. See you next time.